encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. If you want to be a serious Bible student, a successful servant, and a powerful preacher, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome to Preachers in Training. My name is Robert Hatfield, and this is the podcast on which we discuss all things preaching and ministry. I want to welcome you into Season 16, Episode 10 of the podcast, on which today we will be discussing the kind of preaching that godly elders want. Are you intrigued by this? Do you sometimes find this to be an ethereal type of topic? You know what? How do I please my elders? Here to help us discuss that topic today is Brett Pharr, joining us from the Nashville, Tennessee area. First-time guest on Preachers in Training. Welcome. We're really glad to have you today.
Thank you, Robert. Good to see you again. And
yes, sir.
Look forward to chatting about this fun topic.
I am looking forward to it as well. Brother Brett was one of my elders at Gold Hill Road back in the day before he swiftly moved to Nashville 3 months later.
I hired you and ran.
There you go. I got to get out of here. I'd started the timer on the bomb, and now I'm gone. And in addition to that, I know, of course, you served as an elder for what, 20, 25 years at Gold Hill?
21 years there, 21.
Okay, 21 years. And, of course, you grew up in a preacher's family, all of that stuff. You just said before we hit the big red record button that these are your people. You feel at home among us here at Preachers in Training, so we appreciate that.
So I've got lots of preachers in the family and know what they deal with a lot, so see it from all sides.
Sure. In addition to your experience and leadership in the church, you also are quite accomplished in the business world. You want to sort of tell people what you do in real life?
Well, I'm a banker. I have been for 40 years, and I'm currently the CEO of a public bank, and been doing that I've been with that company about 4 years, but I'm in the financial world, and I often joke that I have God and mammon covered. So there.
Wow. Okay. Nice. Well, you bring a lot of wisdom to the table, and appreciate your time today. I'm looking forward to getting into this a little bit. I remember several years ago now, before I moved to Gold Hill, you spoke at the Better Conference with the Jenkins brothers and Jenkins Institute. And I think maybe your topic was something similar to this, and I think that's why you popped in my mind when this particular topic came up. And I remember benefiting so much from that then, looking forward to some things that we're going to dive into today. As we think about the kind of preaching that godly elders want, where do we need to begin?
You know, I obviously would begin with the truth, and that's I think that's given table stakes that we'd all agree to. But there's the truth, and then there's sometimes certain audience can't handle the truth, and so one of the things that's pretty important to remember, and that will help preachers with their elders, is some expedience and thought about what truths are presented that might, from a macro environment that isn't in every case, there's some expedient thought that needs to go around it, some wisdom, or maybe in a particular circumstance. So, classic example, if you're going to be teaching the truth, you'll be preaching about the sin of practicing homosexuality. There ought to be a discussion with your eldership in advance of such topics about how much we're going to talk about this. Is there a conversation with parents prior to discussion of that, or any number of topics that are a little bit more sensitive? Being careful about there's the truth, but the application of truth in certain audiences is something to consider. And so I think most do that, but it's important to sort of take a caution about that. Yes. The other thing is having your ear to the ground of what's going on in the congregation. There may be truth that has to be handled with a great deal of wisdom as well. There may be circumstances that are going on, and you have to be very careful to where preaching might not be singling out or poking a particular audience or audiences in the congregation without a conversation with your eldership, because those are the kinds of things that elderships, have messes and they have to go clean up. And so I think having some thought about that. So both that macro and then very specific thing, you got to apply some wisdom.
Yeah. And we're not, nobody's saying anything about compromising truth. And sometimes preachers get this notion of, well, I've got to preach the truth or whatever. And it's like, well, yeah, but yes, but your elders are also responsible for feeding the flock and for shepherding the flock. And they may know stuff that you don't know. So you
Yeah.
need to talk about that. Yeah.
Well,
And I mean, they don't call them elders for nothing. They've been around. They've got the wisdom. They may have some thoughts about how to best approach this to hit hearts in the best way.
yeah, I think that's exactly right. And to really, I mean, even if we're engaged in personal evangelism,
Mm.
the wise personal evangelist knows at a given point in time when is the right thing to share a particular element of truth, or maybe it's not time yet. Jesus did that very same
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
So it's applying, the line from the movie, "You want the truth, you can't handle the truth." Well, there are circumstances where that might be the case, and so have some wisdom around that, and use your elders to figure out what's appropriate in a given point in time.
Yeah, that's great. Sermon plans. We talk a lot about sermon planning on this podcast. Sermon plans can be your friend there because not only can you sort of forecast and sort of get the feel as you're leading up to a sermon is coming up, but your elders also have that luxury as well. No surprises, which is always a good thing.
Yeah, no surprises. That's good.
Yeah. Okay. Shall we move to number 2?
Yeah, which kind of is a natural feed in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is the old joke is by the time you have 3 kids in the house, you're not interested in justice, you're interested in peace, right? I don't really care who's right or who's wrong. I just want peace.
Yes.
Perhaps that's not good parenting advice, but sometimes that happens. And I think to some extent, within the right boundaries, elders are very interested in peace.
Mm-hmm.
They get picked at by sometimes a minority group, on and on and on. A preacher shouldn't be adding to that, absence of peace and the scabs that are torn off and all those kinds of things. And so,
Mm-hmm.
having a little bit of recognition that any action that you take in the congregation could foster an environment that is disruptive, and the elders lose some peace in that. And that may not have anything to do with preaching. That might have something to do with moving the furniture around in the foyer to suit your liking, or putting up a bulletin board in a different place. And then you find out that Sister So-and-so did that 20 years ago, and now they're not. It's those kinds of things that being a little bit thoughtful about how you act and interact with all elements of your role, so that you don't create a problem that creates a
Yeah.
lot of disruption. So
The
peace matters.
reality is, in most cases, the preacher has probably not been there as long as the elders have been. I know sometimes there are notable exceptions, but the elders may know all that history that Johnny come lately brother preacher doesn't know.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And so again, not unlike the comment about preaching the truth,
Mm-hmm.
think about all aspects of the ministry. How do we foster peace and minimize the disruption that might come towards the elders when it's not necessary?
I'm a big fan of church organization, and particularly in the sense that elders, deacons, and preachers are all on the same team. And sometimes we act like we're in competition with one another, but everybody needs to stay in his respective role and function together. It's almost like that's the plan.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
That helps a lot. All right,
Yeah,
elders want peace, and yeah. There's so many ways that preachers can help to bring that about. And by the way, elders need our encouragement too. And often just a word of thanks, public or private, can go a long way. Just like it goes a long way when an elder does that to you, public
that's
or
right.
private.
That's
Yeah,
right. Yeah, everybody likes some recognition. There's no doubt about it. So
yeah,
even though it may seem a little self-serving, preacher saying something nice about the elders from the pulpit is a good idea.
yeah. That's right. We're talking about the kind of preaching that godly elders want. And I know some of these we're going to maybe spend a little more time with than others, and that's why I'm not trying to hasten through some of these, but we've listed two of them so far. Of course, the truth, and that includes expedient truth, and then peace. What's number 3 on our list today?
You know, now we're getting into some real meat, which
Mm-hmm.
is supporting the vision of the congregation that is being brought forward by the shepherds of the church. Now, that immediately begs a key question. Does the congregation have a vision or perhaps a couple of visions that are unique and special and based on the unique circumstances that exist within that church for you to support? And
Mm-hmm.
just to take a little detour here, if you don't have something that is really special in your congregation that you want to focus on, you need to find it. And of course, we're all about getting people to heaven. Amen to that. We're all about the Great Commission, yes, but
Mm-hmm.
that's a very broad thing. Where is it that the congregation is going to emphasize its efforts and then support that in what you're doing in your preaching and in your lessons and in your personal interaction with the congregation? You mentioned that the elders, the preacher, and the deacons are all on the same team. Well, they all need to be after the same vision for
Mm.
the congregation, and there are many kinds of visions that can be emphasized, and it could be we're going to focus because we're near it on the inner city ministry. We're going to focus on domestic missions because we have the resources to help.
Mm.
We're going to focus on, as we had over in Gold Hill, church planting,
Yeah.
or any number of other things that might be unique to that congregation. And then talking about it all the time, you're supporting the elders in doing that. And by the way, bringing lessons from time to time that are in keeping with that
Mm.
help to reinforce the message. One of the powerful things, it's a byproduct of having a strong vision in a congregation and everybody aligned to it, is it stops a lot of noise.
Mm.
Congregations can have noise, and it can be noise about all kinds of things, from which programs we're doing to the color of the carpet to any number of things. But if you've got a vision that people are aligned to and you tie everything to that, it helps to minimize the noise to some extent. So support the mission and the vision that your eldership has laid out and be sure they have one.
Yeah. So we're talking primarily to preachers here. I do know some elders who listen to this podcast, and I know sometimes maybe preachers may share resources like podcasts that are particularly helpful with their shepherds. But assuming we're just talking to the preachers now for a minute, um, they're thinking, we don't really have much of a vision. You got any tips or ways that the preacher can maybe encourage that along or help the shepherds in that? Or maybe even this may be a part B to this question, if I'm a preacher for a congregation that does not have an eldership?
You know, you mentioned earlier having a sermon series plan or a preaching
Mm-hmm.
plan as an important element of the occupation, and I agree with that completely. And a lot of times, those will be developed over 12 months, or it may be there's a quarter at a time that you're going to do, and then you work through those things. Having regular interactions with your elders that says, I'm working on this. How can my plan help support the things that you're thinking about? And
Mm.
then as you get those, coming back around and saying, are we talking to the congregation about those? And maybe as I kick off this series, can one of the shepherds get up front and talk about why we're focused in this direction and emphasizing it? So
Mm.
yeah, I mean, there's not necessarily always going to be an eldership that deep strategic thinkers and are going to,
Mm-hmm.
think about our strengths and our weaknesses and opportunities and threats and come up with it. You may have to lead them a baby step at a time through that. And certainly, if there's no elders and it's more of a business meeting kind of focus, it's even harder. Although you could still get some feedback on what do we want to emphasize and how can I help in my lessons to emphasize those things. That's one way I think you could get some inertia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's really good. I like that idea of getting some involvement in the sermon planning process. It occurs to me that uh, for some of us that will take a little bit of humbling ourselves, maybe to some degree. I mean, some guys maybe keep that kind of close, and frankly, I think the reason why some preachers are reluctant to open up sermon requests is because that's going to mean maybe a little more work for them. It may
Yep.
require them to preach different types of sermons than maybe they might typically come up with. Or maybe it will require them to accept a vision other than the one that they personally have.
Yeah.
And in as much as this is a preacher show, sometimes we have to look in the mirror a little bit and let it sting a moment.
That's right. That's exactly right. And it can be more work,
Hmm.
because, but it's also going to be more rewarding, I think, both
Mm,
for the preacher and the congregation, if you can
right.
figure out how to align that. So,
Yeah.
and over time, then it'll give you more focus, because as a vision becomes clearer, you're going to be thinking about, oh, well, here's another series or topic that I could be doing that helps with this.
Yeah. And there's something rewarding about kind of being in the trenches together, and you can look back at a series of study and even a body of work, whether that's teaching or whether that's even, service activities or things that we've done. But because we've done that together, it's solidified us together. And maybe this isn't what it's all about in preaching, but to even know personally, I've made a difference. I've helped. I've
Yeah.
done something. I can see the results, which are always encouraging.
Right.
So support the vision of the congregation, and don't have one, get one. You can help with that as the preacher
Yeah.
to go that direction. All right. I've got this. I've got the cheat notes in front of me here, which is great. I love this. Meeting the needs of the unlearned and the learned, I think, is where we're going next in number 4. What do we mean by that?
So, in an order of difficulty, this starts getting higher. But the best preachers, at least from my perspective, are ones that meet the challenge of this. So, in any given audience, you have listeners that range from, a very, very elementary knowledge, if any, of the scriptures and the message of the gospel, to deep Bible students who know a lot and may, in fact, know as much as the preacher knows. In trying to provide in your lessons content that gives things for both and doesn't lose either audience. The first audience, because they don't know what you're talking about. The second audience, because they're bored to tears. I think is a skill that you have to work on and have to really develop.
Mm,
And I think about, my own listening to sermons over the years. In the current circumstance, we listen to Dan Chambers at Concord Road, and of course
mhm,
he's a tremendous Bible student and preacher. But um, the person can walk in off the street and listen to Dan and learn things from him, but he will drop hints throughout
mm,
the lesson to where somebody that might know a little more, like myself, I know what he meant by that phrase because I connected to something else.
mm,
And I hadn't thought about that connection before. And being able to really have in your sermons something for everyone. So everyone, and again, I think this is a high degree of difficulty, but it's something you got to be thinking about. And as you sort of finish the sermon preparation and you kind of go back and you're reviewing it, think about it, go through it once from the lens of, the elementary hearer, and then go through it the second time from the lens of the advanced hearer,
mm,
and see if you think there's something there for both. I think that's a important skill set.
mm. That's a challenge for younger preachers because we don't know what we don't know,
Yeah,
right? And so,
yeah,
you know, you're trying to put yourself in the shoes of that sister who's been a Christian for
that's right.
57 years,
That's right.
but you've never been a Christian for 57 years. That can be really hard. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, an extreme example of this is talking about John 3:16.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't be anything more elementary. And make a passing reference to the Nehushtan, which is
Mm.
actually in verse 14 above, a reference to the Old Testament. Well, you might mention that. Well, the elementary person has no clue what is being talked about,
Yeah.
and even most of the advanced do not. But it may spur a thought that says,
Mm-hmm.
"Let me go think about that and understand what was being talked," because that preacher just planted the seed for me to go learn from. So
Mm-hmm.
now, part of this is, and some of this is myself as a listener. I have a great deal of intellectual curiosity, right?
Mm.
So really understanding why something was said, and the best Bible students are going to do that, right? They're going to
Mm-hmm.
pick that up. So thinking about that, I just think it's very valuable, and it makes for a sermon, a preacher that's all well rounded for the congregation.
Absolutely. It's going to require we do our homework, stretch
Yeah,
ourselves a little bit,
yeah,
and
yeah,
perhaps even if I find myself preaching on John 3:16 this year, it means I may approach it differently, or may even study it afresh from
yeah,
however I approached it 3 years ago, or whenever I last hit the
yeah,
verse. So,
yeah.
yeah,
That's right. That's right.
that's good. All right. Meeting the needs of the unlearned and the learned. Yeah, that's good. Sometimes preachers approach preaching like, every sermon is evangelistic sermon, and perhaps there is an evangelistic element, in there somewhere, but by and large, we're preaching to the saved,
Yeah,
at least in our worship services. So let's keep them coming back to the well, and demonstrating in our sermons that there's more of a supply than we could ever begin to exhaust. Yeah.
I think that's good.
Number 5 is one that I heard you hit on a lot recently in some leadership talks that you were giving at the Connect conference: changing hearts and not just minds, and creating motivation.
Yeah.
Uh, Mind elaborating on that for us as we think
Yeah,
about the kind of preaching you want as an elder?
and I think this has been an important transition that I've seen in my lifetime. As I was a kid and coming up, we're still in a sort of an authoritarian mode of, okay, here's the information you need, now go do it.
Mm,
And while that was not always successful, that was sort of the focus and what was emphasized. As we think about the generational shifts that have occurred, and frankly, as I think about getting a better result, um, it's almost you have to lead with the getting the conviction that's in there, the conviction of the heart, so that the mind can follow and go with it,
mm,
and making sure that you have that right balance of adopting the message, because adopting the message is two parts. It's the heart and the mind. So when you go through things, you got to realize, we say 7 times 7 ways. Um, you know, you can tell me something, and I have the information, and I can file that information, but I may not adopt that information until it's presented to me in a variety of different ways, so that it really becomes a part of my thinking. And
mm.
hearts and minds, convicting them, creating within them. This is one of the things we talked about. A shared need, which is, here's something that really needs to change, and it's not just telling them it needs to change, but getting to the point where they emote into, there really needs to be a change.
Mm.
And I think that's a key part of what our preaching should accomplish. I think, again, the best way this happens is the good mix of scriptural content and reasonable application, so that people can see how it affects their lives directly, or it may affect other people's lives directly, causing them to really want to act on it. So it's a tough one, but it's important. Changing hearts and minds.
Yeah. I think a lot of times as preachers, we think, well, hey, I mean, you're looking at the same scripture I am. Either sometimes we think, well, the application ought to be evident, or at the very least, you ought to have buy-in on this just because it's God's word.
Yeah,
And, I guess there's a level of truth to that, but practically speaking, uh, convincing does have to be done. Paul was reasoning with the people as he explained the message of Scripture. This isn't completely foreign or something that's unique even to our time. That you have to convince people and then help them to be convicted by pointing them to those passages that will and the applications of them that'll help to make it a part of who they are, their lives.
Yeah, in the workplace, we talk about a migration of adoption.
Mm.
And sometimes our first response to a message that we don't want to hear, even if it's in the text, is yes, but. And the yes, buts are strong, right? I mean, I think that's what James 1's talking about. I always call it clean, weed out your garden before you receive the word, right? Which is able to save your soul. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the yes, buts, and then as we think about having respectful dialogue in the workplace, we start getting to the yes and so yes
Mm.
and there's this other thing. Um, Really getting to the point where you've captured the hearts and minds. You're there when you've been through those processes and people hear it and they say yes.
Mm.
And that's maybe a simple way to think about it, but a lot of times I remember teaching not too long ago from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where it says, "Why not rather be defrauded?"
Mm-hmm.
And I was in a Bible class, and I got some looks on some things where I kind of said this pretty strongly. Why not just lose it? And
Mm.
and I got a yes but answer, which was, well, what do you want me to be, a doormat? I mean, that's a yes but, right?
Right.
So it's, how do you work through that and make that happen? And so you got to get to that heart piece, not just the mind.
Yeah. Um, I suppose this could happen in a lot of ways. You're talking about saying things in different ways, and maybe in the same content, but presenting it seven different times, or however that went, to ensure that people are. I keep trying it until it hits a heart in a way that actually will resonate
Right.
and penetrate and bear fruit. I also think, though, that authenticity is one of these buzzwords, being genuine in our day, and maybe that for good reason. We ought to be authentic in our faith,
Right.
but
Right.
as preachers, we talk about the importance of showing up and being there for the births and the hospitalizations and the funerals and things like that. And
Yeah.
while that in and of itself doesn't preach maybe specific content, at least it builds trust and may make
Yeah.
it to where someone is more likely to receive whatever it is that we teach when we teach it from God's word. So I'm
Yeah.
kind of seeing that both ways there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's right. And again, some of it is generational. I mean, I remember as a fairly young person, somebody was teaching something, and then a pretty famous preacher, and he said, I've said this 3 times, but for those that weren't listening, let me say it again, right? And there was this expectation that once you heard it the first time, you got it. What is the problem?
Yeah.
And I think the approach we have to have is, I realize this is very difficult, and
Mm.
I can see that. Think about it from this other angle, so that
Hmm.
there's both empathy when it's a difficult topic, and that'll allow for some, capturing of hearts and minds.
Yeah. So I want to say, don't pretend to be someone you're not. I don't know if that's exactly the right way to articulate that, but in sermons, it can be very easy to present something just matter of fact,
Yeah,
when actually it is quite complicated, even
yeah,
if it's simple to understand, but it's
right.
complicated to do. Yeah.
Yeah, the
Okay.
application for any particular individual may be really complicated too. It's maybe
Hmm.
simple for me because of my set of circumstances, but a lot harder
Right.
for somebody else. And of course, I think in some ways the hardest part of the scripture for application, the Sermon on the Mount, that alone, is difficult for everybody, right? So,
Yeah. Right.
yeah, I hear what the words are, but how do I apply that? And so, yeah,
Yeah. Especially, it hits home when you realize that most of it is countering the religious leaders of the day.
hey, that's right.
It's like that. That's what the whole thing is about.
Oh, that is, that's right.
Yeah. You've
That's right.
heard, but I say, oh,
Right.
okay. Well,
Yeah,
I've got some work to do.
yeah,
uh, uh, Preachers and elders are on the same team. And boy, I think that's important for us to emphasize as we think about the kind of preaching that godly elders are looking for. I'm sure, our listeners could write in and tell us some of the horror stories of maybe elders that were less than who they should have been. But we're talking about in terms of godly elders. Here are some things and you having served in that role and been in those trenches before are pulling out truth, but make sure that that truth is expedient truth. We're not talking about compromising truth, but we're talking about making sure it's the right time to say some of those things. Peace, shocking, right? And let's make sure that not just what we say, but sometimes even the decisions we made, down to the small things like moving this or that around or changing this or that out, may be actually what is best for the longevity of the congregation. Supporting vision and helping to craft that if it's not there, meeting the needs of everybody who's there. And yes, speaking to those who don't know a lot, but also speaking to those who do and helping them to grow in their relationship with the Lord. And focusing on hearts and not just minds. It's one thing to preach something and to expect people to get it intellectually. It's another thing to default to the compassion that says, I get this. I get this is difficult. Let's walk through it together and look at some practical ways that this can make an impact in your life, and then how this will help to shape you for the desired result, right? That there's a purpose to this. We're not just monks disciplining ourselves just because. All of that a part of this godly preaching that godly elders are looking for. What have we left out? What do we need to say as we sort of begin to land the plane here?
Transparent conversation with your elders, really talking about, hey, here's what I'm struggling with, here's what I'm thinking about, how does this fit? Asking them what they want is tough, but I think that's a good focus. And then, preaching is like every craft. I've been a banker for 40 years. I learn something new every day, and be sure that you're continuing to build on your craft, and that will make you more and more valuable in your elders' eyes if you're continuing to progress and grow in all these different ways. So, like I said, preachers are my people. I love what they do every day. And I love listening to preachers because I do spend more time listening than speaking, and that's good. And I love the elders that are working with them. So that relationship ought to be really symbiotic and go well. So I just pray that all the preachers listening to this are encouraged to, work on these things.
Yeah, thank you. One more question I just thought of. If there's a brother that's saying, I'd like to be vulnerable, I tend to sort of struggle with that. Maybe it's kind of I'm kind of talking to my bosses, if I open up and expose some vulnerability, could that also become a liability for me or for my job security or whatever? What do you say to that guy that's struggling with those thoughts?
And obviously every situation is different. You would
Right.
hope that um, in any eldership that would go well. I can see in some cases that might not be the case. So you have to use some judgment in that.
Mhm.
But don't just assume that you have to be Superman all the time.
Yeah.
Especially if you're younger. You may know a lot and be very very capable, but with the old phrase, you don't know what you don't know,
Yeah.
and opening up a little bit, I think, will be accepted. Sometimes we're worried about opening up because of our own egos, and
Right.
that can be tough. But yeah, you have to use a little judgment, but I still think that ought to be seriously considered.
Yeah. And you might too could open up with something that's maybe of a little lesser consequence to see how it goes.
That's right.
Stick your toe
Baby
in the
steps.
water and
That's right.
and go from there.
That's
Absolutely.
exactly right. Yeah.
Well, wow, I appreciate the wisdom in each of these points. I think you've given us all some food for thought, some things for us to sort of take back and to find ways to work into our preaching and into our ministry, and particularly in the ways that we interact with our shepherds. And all along the way, we've challenged us to let the shepherds be the shepherds and do your work as a preacher, fulfill your ministry. And I really appreciate that a lot. Appreciate all you do. And I didn't mention earlier, you're on the board at Freed-Hardeman as well. So got a lot of connections and a lot of influence throughout the brotherhood. And for that, I am grateful. Thank you. And thanks for taking some time to be with us
Thank you.
today.
Thank you for doing this. So
Yeah,
good
yeah,
talk.
it's an honor. I enjoy it as well, and I enjoy you being a part of this episode today. Thanks so much. TheLightNetwork.tv is where you can contact us. It's also where you can find previous episodes. We've got 15 seasons in the backlogs. Go and check them out. Do a search. You'll find something there that I think will bless your life and your ministry. We'd love to hear from you. Preachers at TheLightNetwork.tv is the email address. And don't forget to hit subscribe in your favorite podcast app or on YouTube if you like to see our lovely faces and our backgrounds and all of this stuff. You just search for Preachers in Training or my name, Robert Hatfield, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Brand new episodes release on Thursdays from TheLightNetwork.tv and our podcasting partners. That's going to do it for this edition. Thanks so much for being with us. Until next time, let's go preach the word.